we're going to do proper introductions after a 10-minute introduction from me on overlays in general. And so we have David O'Neill from the Paciello group. We have Cyndi Rowland from WebAIM. We have Anil Lewis from the National Federation of the Blind. Give us a wave, Anil. And Al Hoffman from Deque Systems. Give us a wave. And we have Karl Groves from Tenon. And I have to just get my PowerPoint running. So panelists, if you could just turn off your video now. And what I will do is bring up my screen here. Hold on just a moment. We spent so much time getting reconnected and chit-chatting that I forgot to put the thing together. Okay, there we go. And then let's make sure I share the screen here. Show. Okay, hopefully you can see the PowerPoint show there.
Looks good.
Yep. Good, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to start off with, I know that a number of folks are in our audience are newcomers to the field, maybe haven't been exposed to overlays and the issues of overlays. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time here at the beginning just to explain what accessibility overlays are. Okay, so I like this quote. This is in the this starts off the short paper that's in the proceedings about what is an accessibility overlay. So this is a quote from Brad Henry from the Paciello group from this year. Accessibility overlays are applications and coding that sits between your website or other digital content and assistive technology. The goal is to allow business owners and compliance managers the ability to make their website more accessible without having to change the underlying source code, thus providing accessibility at a fraction of the time and cost, comparatively speaking. So a lot of articles start like this, just to lay the groundwork of what accessibility overlays are. And then comes a big but. And lots of buts. Okay, we'll get into the big buts in just a minute. Okay. So what do overlays actually do? They modify the HTML code after the page load, but before the end user interacts with the content. So things that they do to websites, code changes, they do things like they add missing alternate text, they add missing attributes, event handlers, structural information. They might add some sort of functionality or features like text resizing, focus enhancement, color scheme adjustments, those types of things. So we've got a visual representation of this. I'll walk you through it. What we have is a website, and we're representing a website that is not necessarily accessible because it's got, we're representing it by the sort of red lock icon. The user interacts via the accessibility overlay and therefore gets an accessible, in theory, an accessible experience, and so it's represented by the green unlocked thing. So the overlay is not necessarily modifying the original website's code. It sort of sits there and it does its work when required. It does impact the end user experience, end users who are using assistive technologies. Okay.
Hey, Chris, this is Terry. I just want to let you know that everybody's hearing a little clicking sound, and
yes, I'm sorry for the clicking sound. This is we found out what the clicking sound is. The clicking sound is my little camera, and it's got a motor inside it trying to focus. We've had focus issues all week. I think it's really designed for one person sitting in one place all the time,
No. Okay, no worries.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. So that's what it is.
Hey, Chris,
Yeah.
it actually stops whenever you were trying to share the screen, so it might be just the vibration.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Anyway, so hopefully we can get through that. Okay. Anyway, types of overlays. We have tool-based overlays such as toolbars, plugins, third-party widgets. It can be JavaScript-based. And a note here, not all overlays are created equal. There's many, many different types of overlays. Certain types have more complicated implementations than others, either from a technical perspective or from the impact of the audience they aim to serve. I said there was a big but. On my screen, I've got a very, very big but ... Okay. The accessibility testing field does not espouse the approach where you don't have an accessible website to begin with, right? So the papers and the presentations that we've heard at this conference and in other conferences from accessibility testing professionals is the goal is really to fix your digital content. And so I put a little cross through the locked icon, and the green padlock is open padlock of the now accessible content is there. So there's no need for an overlay. There's no overlay. It's just a sort of direct connection in here. Okay. So that's the first but, and then the second but. This was all sort of known very commonly in the past, but there's two key things that really happened at the beginning of this year that really brought about the need for this panel. The first is, and I've got some images here of articles, one written by Karl who's on our panel. The article is called Automated Lies with One Line of Code. There's an article from Level Access called Lies, Damned Lies, Overlays and Widgets, with somebody shown with a little fingers crossed behind their back. The claim that is coming out of a lot of developers and vendors of overlays is 100% conformance. And a lot of us in the accessibility testing field are like, wait, what? There's no feasible way to create 100% conformance with WCAG using an automated system at this stage. We know the technology just does not exist, but that's the claim that is being made, and it's the impression that a lot of people who don't know accessibility are getting. So that was the first one. The second thing that happened is something that's I'm just going to call it sneaky started happening. And people wrote about this and discussed this online already. There's references to it, and the articles you can read in the paper that goes along with this panel. It started with WAVE. What WAVE is a tool to do is WAVE. It's a web accessibility evaluation tool from WebAIM. Cyndi Rowland is on the panel today. She's with WebAIM. WAVE is a tool that you can use to interrogate a website and then try to figure out by parsing that code, P-A-R-S-I-N-G, parsing that code, and it determines whether it's accessible. So it looks to see whether it's got if it has alt text and other accessible features, and then that information goes back and WAVE then presents it to you, and it's a very useful testing tool. I've got a very soft spot in my heart for WAVE because it was one of the earliest ones that I ever saw, earliest implementations of this, probably more than 20 years ago, I think. So what happened this year, which caused some articles to be written, what actually happened was that the overlays got in the way, and somebody wrote some intercept code for overlays that then detected that this site was being interrogated by an accessibility checker, and then intercepted that and then sent back a false result. and said, no, everything's fine, everything's great. It's more complicated than that, but that's the basic gist of it, that they were spoofing the accessibility checkers. Okay, so those two things led to us, many of us having conversations at the beginning of this year and saying, you know, well, as a service to the accessibility field, why don't we get together and talk about this? Okay, so before I get into my first questions for the panelists, I would like them to each introduce themselves. So panelists, please go back to your videos and we'll do some quick introductions here. Okay. And for everybody that's on this, for people that are visual, I would suggest switching to gallery view. You'll get a better experience out of the panel from that. We'll have everybody's cameras on throughout the session. So just a quick introduction from everybody, and then we'll get into the first question. And I'm going to sort of start with the way I see my screen around. So that's the order I'm going in. So I'm actually going to start with Anil. If you could.
Hey, Chris, thanks for setting this panel up. I feel like the redheaded stepchild with all the other panelists and the expertise that they bring to bear, but I definitely think that the consumer perspective that's represented by the members of the National Federation of the Blind is key to this discussion, and looking forward to the panel discussion. I'm sorry, I'm the Executive Director of Blindness Initiatives for the National Federation of the Blind, and in that capacity, I handle education, employment, access technology, and research that we handle a lot of our National Federation of the Blind Journeyman Institute in Baltimore, Maryland.
Thank you, Anil. Karl Groves.
Karl Groves. I am the founder and president of Tenon.io, manufacturer and seller of the Tenon tool, Tenon.io, as well as various other tools, and also consulting. I've done consulting for about 20 years now.
Cyndi.
Hi, I'm Cyndi Rowland, and I'm the founder and director of WebAIM at Utah State University. And Chris, you just made me feel really old that you'd been to WAVE 20 some years ago, but yeah.
But I do have a special place in my heart for it.
Thank you. We love that folks have a soft spot for our little tool.
Thank you. And David O'Neill.
Hi, and congratulations to you, Chris and Matt, for another successful symposium. I'm David O'Neill. I'm the Chief Architect for SaaS Solutions for the Paciello Group. It's a pleasure to be here on the panel with such esteemed colleagues. So let's have a good session.
Thanks. Thanks, David. And finally, Alan Hoffman.
Hello, folks. I'm Al Hoffman, and I work with Deque Systems, and formerly in the federal government. And I don't have any tools myself, but Deque does sell tools, and I think I'm kind of like the rest of you had been doing this for ages, and we've seen overlays for ages of one sort or another. So I'm glad to be here, and I think this is an important topic to kind of raise awareness for, get people to understand where these things fit in the grand scheme of life.
Thanks, Al. Great. And the way that we're going to handle these questions, I've got some questions prepared in advance for the panelists. If you in the audience have questions that you would like to ask during this panel, in the live session, you just raise your hand, and Stacy will be monitoring that and letting us know when that happens. I'll try to keep my eye on it as well. Also, you can ask questions in the Slack channel, and Stacy will be monitoring that as well for us. So thanks, Stacy, for doing the duties there. I ask questions, and I'm just really going to sort of pick on people at random to start the questions, and then we'll have answers from various people in the audience. So the first question, actually, I'm going to start with Karl, because I picked on him with his article that he had there. The first question: can claims such as 100% accessibility conformance be substantiated with respect to overlays?
I mean, that one's probably the easiest one. I wish I'd pick something harder, but no. Yeah, and the logic of this is really, really simple, right? Which is that when it comes to testing, since it's the test symposium, we all know, or at least we all should hopefully know, that there's very limited number of things that can be tested for automatically. And so these are going to be things that are programmatically obvious, things like missing alt attributes, missing form field labels, things like that. Some of the things can be tested for, but need to be verified by a human. So, so we can test, for instance, whether an image has an alt. We can also run a series of tests to determine if the alt looks suspicious, and then the human has to verify it. And then there's things where it's just literally either too programmatically complicated or too subjective in nature to be able to test. As a matter of fact, I believe it was last year at the symposium, Jared Smith gave a great presentation on the complexities of testing color contrast. And so just on our own side of things at Tenon, we actually have a series of conditions where we just say, nope, not even going to test contrast, right? Things like absolute positioning, CSS3 transitions, contrast where there's a background image, all these sorts of situations where Tenon's just like, nah, I'm not even touching that because of the complexity and because of some of the other various conditions, you know, that make that hard. So then if we think through, we have this list of things that we can test for. Then we think through, okay, how much of these things can I fix? That list is much smaller. For Tenon, for instance, we have 227 tests in production. We have a new product ourselves, which is an automatic fixing tool, and we can only fix 80 things. So of the massive list of things we can test for, which we know is still not complete of all the things that you should test for, 34% of it's going to be fixed. So it's just based on raw numbers and logic. It's an absolute misunderstanding of accessibility to think that any tool could automatically do this.
So it's not that it's 95% of the way there. It's really that it's only like 35% of the way there or less or something like
Less, even less,
Yeah.
right? Because we're talking about 35% of the automatic things, which is actually only 25, isn't it? 20. So we're in the teens, I think, in the teens.
Who would like to follow up on that? Anil? Or let's, David had a hand, so I'll go to David, then we'll go to
I would yield to Anil if Anil would like to speak.
Just one really quick point that Karl brought out, and I hope people noticed in the last part of his answer, he says, I don't think that it should. And I think that's important because I think that when people listen to the problems that he just described, the motivation then, well, let's see what we can do to make sure that this overlay does do that. And I don't think that should be the goal. And some of that hopefully will come out in the further discussion, but just recognizing that there perhaps is a utility, but trying to make the overlay the overall solution, I think is the wrong pathway.
David?
Yeah, so I would have to say that I think, first of all, there are no unicorns and there are no magic wands that are going to make an inaccessible implementation suddenly conform or compliant, and certainly not accessible. And so I think Karl lays out a very appropriate way of rationalizing that through his exploration of pure automated testing and what we find in this field. I would add to that, you know, scientifically, there are sufficient publications and documents out there that have been written by our colleagues that thoroughly explore these claims and debunk the myths. Right? You know, this is, you know, and it's somewhat irresponsible to have a marketing message out there that suggests that it is even remotely possible to do so. I would add one thing though, which is that it is human nature to chase unicorns, right? And that's okay. And actually, I think there's a lot of value in that because it helps us to evolve and to innovate. But, you know, the key here is that we need to look, where is the real opportunity with this pursuit? Where's the real opportunity for this pursuit? And I think the real opportunity does not necessarily lie in our current notion of an overlay, but it actually maybe lies in other areas of the accessibility architecture where we can apply some of the things that we're trying to do with new technologies to healing opportunities. But I think that needs to be brought back into the authoring environment more so than it needs to be put forward in the user experience. So, you know, and I think that's going to be a very healthy thing for us to discuss and work together with as a field in the coming decade. How do healing technologies play out, and where do they belong in the overall architecture of accessibility?
Cyndi, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, well, I have a flood of things that are coming to mind, but I'm just going to mention or add two other elements into this part of the discussion. The first is this notion of can claims be substantiated? For those of us that do testing, we assume that there is a site out there in a fairly static state, right? And where we can go ahead and take a peek at it. But the way that the testing overlays are, or the way that some of the overlays are working, as it goes into, as you said, there's this intercept code that'll go in and then it'll change the view. It's assuming that the user itself will do something with that page before the user is using it. So as a person myself with low vision, I would need to go in and invoke low contrast to be able to get a better contrast. But what if I don't do that? If I'm just looking, I'm rooting around and I just want to go to one page, am I really going to go through everything that is involved to setting up my own profile for that page to invoke low contrast? Well, probably not. So the question is even a little more complicated, because it's not just, can it claim that it can give me better contrast? Because guess what? If I invoke low contrast, now it'll give me better contrast than was in the default setting. But what is my responsibility as a user to interact with that content? Folks that use this believe that that users, or folks that produce the overlays, believe that users do have some measure of accountability. That's something I would dispute, but that's something to think about and something to talk about. The other thing that I'd like to toss into the conversation is to the extent that overlays are getting slapped recently, and sites are getting slapped for being inaccessible, and folks are using overlays as a solution. It's sometimes because of court action. And we see a lot of instances where the courts are asking entities to run automated tests on a regular basis to show the courts that they are that they are in compliance. And for me, it begs the question of, none of us can ever understand the motivation or the incentive of other people. But for me, it does beg the question of what is the incentive here? What is the motive of someone who would prefer to use a site that's going to fake out the automated testing tools so that they could possibly return the results to the courts as requested as being in conformance? So this a broader, and whether you land on the side of nefarious or land on the side of an accidental, mistake in the pursuit of unicorns, as David would say, is anyone's guess.
Yeah, I didn't mention lawsuits in my introduction there, but yes, anybody that's keeping an eye on accessibility in the news recently, there's been lawsuits related to this. I guess my sort of wrap up on this particular point, a good one here would then be, okay, what do we expect the courts to say regarding this claim of 100% conformance? Do you think it's really going to be thrown out? Al?
Yes, I think we left kind of an important topic out here. as part of, can this be substantiated?
Mhm.
I think you have to go back. First of all, overlays are not testing tools. So in and of themselves, they're actually fixing tools. So assuming that they're going to actually do that and provide 100% coverage, it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And then second of all, if you think about it, in theory, if you took a page and you tested it, and then you figure out all the fixes that have to be done to that page, and then you put them in as okay, this is wrong, replace with this, which could go all the way up to replace the whole page. In theory, I suppose you could be at 100% compliant with an overlay type architecture. But if you're going to do all that, you might as well just fix the page. I mean, that's just the reality. If you're going to do all that work, you might as well fix the page. And besides that,
I don't know.
You would have to. It's not maintainable. Like if you did all that, right? And some things probably technically can't be done at the overlay stage. So just thinking of it from a practical perspective, they're not testing tools. They're just fixing tools. So you can't substantiate with a fixing tool.
Karl?
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is something that you were planning on discussing later or not, but I do want to sort of put it out there that I do feel that it is entirely appropriate to fix things at the presentation layer. To Al's point, there is going to be a point at which you don't want to do that. But let me give you an example. Many years ago, I worked for a company called Simply Accessible, which has since been purchased by Level Access. And we were working on a contract with Target Canada. And Target Canada had a presentation of a map, and that map would show you where in your area there was a Target, and also whether that Target had a pharmacy and things like that. The problem was they were using Google Maps to do that. Now there was a business case decision made to use Google Maps to present this information. Google Maps, however, was inaccessible. So what we did, and actually I'll give credit to the developer who did it, Jeff Smith, who's still at Level Access. What Jeff did was hacked the Google Map after the fact. So in other words, there's the Google Maps JavaScript, and there's Jeff's JavaScript that fixes the pins and all that other stuff, so that as you tab through the results of the list, the updates happen on the map and things like that. And so these types of things I do believe are entirely appropriate. If you can fix the thing and you can do it, say, quicker, easier, less of a nightmare, whatever, with your own JavaScript, that's fine. And as a matter of fact, that's kind of what Level Access's Alchemy does. It's what Deque's Amaze does, and that's what Tenon's Spline does. Is there's a series of things that we've decided can be fixed automatically. There's also existing things that can be done in an implementation to fix those after the fact. Some of that stuff gets a little brittle. That's a different thing though, right? Because we're talking about sort of two things. We're talking about the possibility of getting to 100% compliance, which I think we know can't be done. But whether you can actually fix stuff is a different story. In other words, yes, you're not going to get to 100% there. I think we all agree about that. But can that be done? Is this the kind of thing we should definitely think.
So in one scenario there, you've got somebody who's trying to come up with a fix for another inaccessible platform as part of an accessibility solution. Mm-hmm. But in the overlays business model, I think that we're focusing on, it's really about, you got an inaccessible website, you don't really want to make it, you don't really want to put the investor time and effort to do it. So have this one line of code.
And Chris, can I offer an extension of what Karl was saying? Fixing it, that's great, but I think the piece that needs to also be in those tools is they have to convey that specific information back to the developer, because I think that's the key point. If the tool can be used to identify a problem and then let the developer know what needed to be done to fix it, that's a better win-win, because otherwise that developer is going to continue to develop and continue to make those same mistakes, and it's going to become an overly interdependent relationship between the product they're creating and the tool. And I don't know if the businesses who are using these recognize that really creates somewhat of a hostage situation. If they don't develop an infrastructure of individuals with that talent, and they continue to rely on this overlay, what happens when the overlay license fees start going up and up and up, and you just don't have the infrastructure to support your own presence?
And that's where you get into the real issue, at least in my opinion, is the ethical side of it, right? Which, like to Anil's point, you become a hostage to this thing as soon as it's gone. In other words, let's say you're like, I'm not paying this fee anymore. So is your accessibility. Your accessibility is gone.
Yeah, and you're left with a wreck.
Yeah. And so, okay, so we know the claims of conformance are wrong. And we also know that the approach is wrong, to Anil's point, which is to say that something that should be a temporary solution is treated as a permanent solution and is.
Yeah, and I would stop saying solution. I'd like using words like Band-Aid, intervention, just to make sure people really understand that this should not be the default, because I see so many people relying on that as the answer, and that's just flawed for usability and in the business case. It's just flawed.
Keen-eyed observers in the crowd will notice that there are no actual representatives from the companies that are producing accessibility overlays on this panel. This is something that we did all discuss at the beginning, and we decided that this year the first instance is for us and our take as an accessibility testing field. It's not like people from those companies come to our conferences, as it were. So it's something that maybe we take from this year, and then we invite commentary and invite participation next year for this subject beyond that. But we wanted to focus on what are the aspects that relate specifically to testing and how it impacts us. And that brings me to the second question. When testing a website for accessibility and an overlay is present, should the site be tested with or without the overlay? I'm going to go to David for this first.
Okay, well, great. So I contemplated that question for the first time when it was presented in this panel outline. And, my reaction to it was, well, how do we do testing today at the Paciello group? And what should our position be? And I actually queried a number of people in our audit teams to get their opinions on this as well. And here's the conclusion that I've come to on this, and I'll try to be brief. First, when looking at overlays, I've kind of categorized the functionality of overlays into three different pieces. One is the assistive technology type widget and gadgetry that might be offered as a supplement to the user experience that may or may not be used by a user, right? So it's just kind of like this optional gadgetry.
Yep.
Number two, the automagical healing properties that insert themselves regardless of your request. In other words, I'm going to transform the DOM as it reaches you, and I'm going to magically fix things for you. And then finally, in that third category, which I don't think deserves any discussion, which is the nefarious cloaking features that make it impossible for you to successfully test using tools like Wave or Arc or Tenon's products, right? That's bad.
That'll be our next follow-up question.
Yeah, so I'm leaving that out. So of the two, category one being the assistive technology gadgetry, what we do when we test is that we set a baseline with our customers. Here's what we're testing with. And sometimes that baseline, if the engagement includes usability testing, will include AT, such as JAWS or perhaps NVDA or some other form of assistive technology that we want to provide insights on. I would suggest that the way we would handle category one of these gadgets, these 8 optional AT gadgets, is to treat it as an additional modality or baseline test case. Because I do think it's important that customers understand that the technology that they're buying or the solutions or band-aids that they're buying, do they actually work, and what problems do they present in the context of real life users? So I think that's one approach that can be taken for that. With respect to the automagical feature set that runs and users don't have a choice, I think it's our responsibility to say, well, this is how the website presents now with this overlay running. Therefore, it is not, an overlay is not necessarily sitting between me as a user and the website. It's actually writing sidecar, and it becomes a part of the implementation. So I think the proper approach is to test it with that overlay and its results and what impact it has on the DOM, because they become one implementation. And again, that raises a whole architecture question as to whether or not it belongs there or somewhere else. But anyway, so that's the approach I would take to the two categories of capabilities that I see in overlays today that are worth talking about.
Mm-hmm. Al, you advise testing teams. What would your advice be?
Well, I'm going to go back a little bit. Depends what you want to get out of your testing. If you want to know the difference between on and off, then test for it. If, as David said, if you want to know the usability for some of the in-browser sort of assistive technology functions, then test for it. So it's not really an on and off choice. It's what do you want to know from your test? If the user's not going to get a choice, and like David said, it's in the DOM and that's what you get, then I test with it because the user doesn't get a choice. So I have a pretty short answer. Depends what you want to know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anil, what if the legal question was posed: is this an accessible website? And
Well, let me do two things with this. One is when we test, we like to test straight, because you got to understand our whole goal is to really move to a place where accessibility is just commonplace, right? And as long as there's a third-party intervention, it's always something that's extra and many people see as a burden or an additional expense. When realistically, it's not that difficult. I love quoting Jeff, formerly of Facebook, that accessible coding is just good coding. So in any instance that's prohibiting that developer from learning how to hone their skill in a way that allows them to develop an accessible page at the design phase, I just don't support. I think that, again, these have the overlays have a place to maybe, intervene while that's being put in place. But I think that realistically, we've got to create a space where the developer knows how to do it. And the other reason is because if we teach them the code to the standard, then all of the other players don't have to continue to be so dynamic in the way that they intervene. So the third-party AT providers, a lot of our testing now we do with NVDA because it doesn't do a lot of the fixing. If it's coded to the standard, chances are it's going to work well with NVDA when you're talking about screen readers. That means that, whether it's designed for Chrome or designed for Chromium or Edge now, designed for Firefox, because many of the developers are using what they come familiar with, their native space. But if they code to the standard, then it should be accessible. And the thing I like about that is if you run into a problem where even coding to the standard creates that problem, then it's better informing the standard, right? So again, creating that same standard space that everybody can operate on, I think should be the key. Really, I'm glad you brought back the litigation. National Federation of the Blind has a reputation of litigation, and it's well earned because we're good at it. But we're good at it because we're strategic about it, right? But that's not the best way we interact with our partners. We're much better partners than litigants. We don't have the resources to sue everybody. And unfortunately, because our reputation of being successful in our litigation strategy, we also get paired with this new click-buy lawsuit stuff that's going on with people just suing based on accessibility with no real intent to move the needle. So I want to make sure that everybody's clear. That's not our goal. That's not our philosophy. That's not our strategy. We have some tremendous partnerships, and many of them have developed out of initial litigation, which we've settled and have taught them that the efficacy of what we're trying to have them adopt really is the smart thing to do, makes good business sense overall. So that's what I'm saying. So The litigation related to this, I think, and I'm not a lawyer, I'll offer as a disclaimer, I think that if an entity puts the overlay as their solution to an accessibility lawsuit, and we're still able to identify that that site is inaccessible, it's still going to be the entity. I don't think the overlay has liability there, because it's the entity making the decision to use that as their tool toward accessibility. So again, it gives the overlay company kind of a safe space, right, to both hold the entity hostage, you know, once they get them overly dependent, without any real liability.
Hmm. Who I see you nodding again, Cyndi. Over to you. What do you think?
No, I completely agree with Anil. You know, I think that certainly our approach with WAVE is that folks need to proceed with caution with testing when there's an overlay. And of course, this even our conversations, I think, get a little convoluted because there are so many different overlays, and which ones are, you know, which ones am I talking about at any particular point in time? You know, for us, and you guys may have seen this for pages where an overlay has detected us and, you know, changed some code. We just now automatically put up a notice that lets the tester know that this is a page that's using that, some features may not be able to be tested in the way that you would expect them to be. And we make a recommendation that folks do testing manually for those pages. So that's, you know, if you're asking, you know, should testing be done with or without, our position is that you can't really know, because there are so many variables. So for us, and it does go back to, well, what's the purpose of your testing? But for us, the answer is going to be, as these things start to, you know, get sprinkled all around, more manual testing will be needed. But we've got to absolutely send out the message here that the emperor has no clothes, and that just can't be underscored enough.
Yeah, my final question in a while will be about that, about what our position statement might be. But yeah, the you know, so in answer, I think from, you know, when a website has an overlay present, should it be tested with or without the overlay? I think we've got sort of two answers here. One, it depends on really what you want to get out of your test. You've got to define what your test goals are. But the other one is really it depends on who your audience is in regards to that question. So, for example, if your audience for that question is a legal case that is being heard, your response is going to be that you have to explain both parts of that. You really do have to, and correct me if I'm wrong in that interpretation, you have to say what the original is like, and then you have to say what the experience is like with the overlay. Did I get that right?
Well, our philosophy is to test as though the overlay didn't exist, unless told otherwise, you know, by a customer, for instance. But because our customer is hiring us to tell them what's wrong with their website, and how it can be improved. And as a matter of fact, version 2 of Tenon's API is going to block those scripts from ever running. Our architecture, our approach is a bit different than Wave's, in that we have full access to the DOM in a way that allows us to determine what even gets loaded. So I can just say, you got something from this domain from Accessibility, just, it doesn't even load. But yeah, because I think from a customer service perspective, it's just one of those things where it's like they want to know what they've done wrong and what they need to improve.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of tricky on this again, and this is why I try to categorize the capabilities of the overlay and separate the decision making around testing based on those categories. If there is overlay technology that is indiscriminately applied, so as that the DOM that is rendered is indiscriminately rendered for the same for everyone, I consider that to be that customer's implementation. Do I agree with it? No. To Anil's point, we should be solving these problems very, very far upstream in the design and development process. We need to educate people how to do this right. But from the perspective of the public users of these sites, if the component of the overlay is indiscriminately applying some JavaScript in an attempt to improve accessibility, and it results in some DOM that's consumed equally by everyone without choice, that is what we will test, because that is their implementation. And and it really gets hairy quickly if we start to try to say, well, we detected that you're using this, let's remove it. Because how about the cases where you referenced one, by the way, Karl, which is we have a custom implementation. Somebody's doing something with Google Maps and they developed some custom workaround that is solving a problem short term, right? That they're doing that is on the net, making something accessible that wasn't otherwise accessible. Yeah, it's tricky, and that's why it's like almost like when we get to that last question, I guess, Chris, when we start to talk about how do we kind of as a field start to lay out standard ways of looking at this and perhaps judging these things more collectively, and I think we're a ways away from that yet, but I think that'll be really helpful. So
yeah. Okay, I want to remind everybody, you can raise your hand if you do have a question throughout the presentation here. Stacy, just want to check in with you, see if there's any Slack questions coming in yet. Matt has a question right next to me, so why don't we go? Stacy, did you see any questions coming in?
Yeah, there's a couple questions. Hold on 1 second, I just switched. Go ahead, Matt, and while I go back to that spot.
So obviously overlays exist because there's a market and a motivation for them. So I almost kind of want to flip the script a little bit. We have a panelist group here that have been solving problems for customers and educating customers for decades. So if I were an entrepreneur, and if that motivation is, I don't have any knowledge of accessibility, I need a cheap solution that can address my accessibility issues as quickly as possible so that experience can be a positive one for all of my end users. Well, I'm the entrepreneur. Can you tell me, in your opinion, like what is that right approach? What is the best way that I can tackle this?
I mean, I've already said before that there's not a problem with applying something that's going to do some automatic fixing of some kind. There, frankly speaking, not a whole lot of problems with the overlays themselves in terms of the fact that, they're trying to solve the problem. The biggest problem, frankly, for me is that the grandiose claims that are demonstrably false and, frankly speaking, I think misleading in a way that's possibly criminal. That's the big issue, right? Crappy products exist out there all the time. There's crappy cars, there's crappy computers, there's crappy products that don't work well are everywhere, right? But none of them are only in male enhancement products, diet products, and accessibility are people making these claims that just simply can't be proven.
Hey, hair growth comes in there.
We don't have an FDA approved equivalent though. So what do we do with that? Al?
So I've got a question that kind of goes back to Matt's point, and motivation, are there any open source free overlay tools people can use? And I'm not aware of any, so I could be wrong. But if to take the money motivation out of that picture, are there any ones that says, well, we think these are a great resource, so here we're just going to put it out there?
I don't know either.
Yeah.
Does anybody know?
But to that point, if there was, then that would result in people actually understanding that it's not really needed, right? If they're going to go through the process of being part of that open source group, they're going to be developing a skill that allows
I just throw that out there as it's an indicator of the motivation behind a lot of
that's a very good point.
tools.
I resonated with the word when Matt was saying awareness. And I think that's really how the overlays are capitalizing on this by creating that market. Many businesses think that this is harder than it is. They think that it's more expensive than it is. And I think that's, the National Federation of the Blind, we're trying to make sure we educate, where we're active with the Teach Access initiative, trying to make sure that people, as they obtain their training in these IT fields, that they recognize that, again, accessible coding is just good coding. Working with our partners to let them know it's better to invest in an infrastructure that's going to be sustainable and more under your control, rather than being held hostage by someone who's offering that piece. But I would tell the entrepreneur, how long do you plan on staying in business? That's the question I would ask. And do you want to become overly dependent on a third party that's going to have a significant control over your ability to stay in business? Or do you want to acquire that skill set internally, which gives you more control and allows you to be more dynamic in the presence that you create?
I do think, Matt, bring up a really, really good question, which is, what should our approach be? At WebAIM, we've had some interesting conversations about this, and Jared Smith forwarded what I think is a provocative question for those of us in the field to take seriously and ask ourselves. Is the proliferation of these tools showing us that as a field, we are failing the customers because there is a lag in what we can provide, because there is, look around for some groups, the cost is high. So what do you say, going back to Matt's question? You've got a customer that doesn't have, they don't have a lot of funds. They may not even have a full-time web developer. What is their solution? And is that showing us that as a field of web developers and accessibility specialists, that we've got skin in the game too here? Let's not be naive here. Are we failing? And is this in a way a clarion call for us to have that conversation as well? Yeah. I think it is. I think it's provocative, and I think it's worth a discussion.
Yeah, I think we're going to return to that at the end as well, with this question of a statement of what we think. I see that there's one hand up, but I know, Stacy, you said that there was a couple of questions came in on Slack, so why don't we tackle those first?
Yeah, so the first one was how do overlays know if they need to be instantiated? For example, are the overlays detecting AT via the browser, or is the browser detecting the AT or sharing the information with the server and then back to the overlays?
Yeah, so that's just a technical implementation question. Who would like to respond? Karl?
Sure. At present, the major players in the overlay space require the user to activate the fixes and the features. So, for instance, if you go to a site, I'm going to try to avoid naming names as much as I can, because I think most of them, if not all of them, work the same way. If you go to a site that has an overlay on it, and you tab, their assumption is that this person who has hit the tab key within a certain period of time after the page is loaded is a person with a disability and needs these enhancements. Then you have to toggle these on to enable this accessibility mode. So that's how the overlays that we're referring to work. You cannot detect an assistive technology through any means that's available to to you as the website owner. There are some weird things that you can do that are impractical and fraught with error and just generally a bad idea. For instance, a long time ago, there was a way you could insert some JavaScript that would talk to some Flash action script to tell you that there was a MSAA enabling assistive technology turn on, like that sort of stuff are useful thought experiments, but on a practical level, you just can't detect those. And so there's no interplay between those things.
I think we get the gist of how that works as a technical question. Thanks for that.
You know, I'd like to toss in in our experience, and at least with one product, they're actually in their code, they would detect anything that came from Wave as something that needed to be changed. So they would intercept that, make the changes, and there you go. And then that's what Wave would be testing. So it wasn't always a user interaction or a user behavior. Sometimes it was, oh, we detect something's coming from a test. And well, it's Wave now. Trust me, it'll be every single test that anyone has.
Well, this is actually my third question, so I'm going to jump into this now. We're going to get to the other questions in just a minute, but while we're on this, I want to stick on this question. So my question that I posed in the paper, and this is about accessibility testers, the person involved here now. The question is, what should accessibility testers do when it is known that an overlay coding is modifying the test results that they're doing? So Cyndi, in your case, you've dealt with this as an organization. What do you actually do? I mean, I think you've said that you notify people. What should the actual person do in relation to their customer as an accessibility tester?
Well, of course, it does go back to what Alan said. What's the purpose of the testing? But let's assume, for the sake of the conversation, that the purpose of the testing is, in fact, conformance to standards. You know, I think that unless it is very obvious what the overlay is doing, and, you know, that can take some expertise to figure all of that out, I think you've got to go back to just doing good old standard manual testing and good old, you know, user testing, and set those set some of the tools aside a bit, because you may not be able to trust them.
Is there something that you can do in the coding? I think Karl, you were mentioning that you're putting in script detectors and things. Is this what you were talking about, of detecting detectors that are fudging the results? Is that right?
Well, you know, in the interest of making sure that that our results are accurate to this philosophy, like I said before, that David also has an interesting counterpoint against, which is that our goal is to test the customer's stuff and not that other stuff. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm hoping to accomplish with it. Is to avoid allowing the waters to get muddied by something else that is beyond the customer's control and potentially temporary.
Does this behavior to anybody seem like it borders on doing something, dare I say, criminal?
That's a really sorry.
Well, yeah, well, that's kind of it, right? Which is to say, you have a customer who is, let's just go back to the Wave user. You have a person who is using Wave in good faith, in a good faith effort to detect the problems on their site so that they can then remediate it on their side of things. So this person is trusting Wave to give them good advice. Wave is unfortunately hampered from doing that. And to the extent that we now have this massively litigious atmosphere in the United States, this person is now, the Wave user is now unable to do the necessary things to ensure their own compliance with the ADA, and therefore increasing their own risk.
Yeah. David.
Yeah, so I think that as testers, when we begin an engagement, we have a responsibility to first document what we know about this implementation, and it should include whether or not the implementation is implementing a form of overlay or technology that has these qualities or behaviors. The next thing is that as testers, we need to know, I'm sure we all, even though we all have our own products, we all take advantage of a variety of tools in order to help us do a thorough job when we're manually evaluating. We have to be prepared, as Cyndi said, to get down to old-fashioned, 100% pure manual testing. I know that that takes longer in many cases, but this is a fact. If you want to be able to provide the customer with insights that they can action on, and tools are unable to do it because of this digital war that's about to start between detection and anti-detection, and it's amazing where we are in the world today. But you need to be able to resort to your manual skill sets in those cases. I would also suggest that as tool providers, perhaps we all need to agree that there's value in us allowing the testing community to be able to report up to us cases where they see this happening, and that we need to have a kind of universally accessible repo of these known issues. That way our colleagues that are doing these tests can all be aware of the impact of these overlays on the effectiveness of our individual products.
Yeah. All right. Any further points that anyone wants to make on this? This is probably the most
I'd just like to offer
question that we've got.
Yeah, to enhance what I was saying earlier, I think it really speaks to, and again, I think I made it clear, kind of our philosophy around this whole piece is the utility of it. If it can be used as a tool in a way that continues to inform, so that the actual skills necessary to create an accessible experience during the design phase is enhanced. And if it's used that way, then I think it can be an effective tool. But if it's used to replace that, I think that that's a lose-lose for everybody concerned, except for the overlay entity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's there's certainly nothing straightforward about this question and about what's happening and what's going on. And I think that I think we're at least starting that conversation. And I think that having some sort of a central place that people could post these things is going to be vital for the community. So yeah. Okay, Stacy, I know that there was another question on Slack, and then we'll go to Madeline, and then we'll go to Amina. Stacy?
Yep. So this one's from Chris. There's a little bit of explanation before, but the question is, do these overlay companies have VPATs, ACRs, and what are the issues with the products themselves?
Do the overlays themselves have VPATs? Anybody seen one?
Just a general statement of, are they following the standards that are out there to support accessibility?
Chris, it's a great question. So I can't speak to whether or not any of these companies have VPATs because I'm just not informed on that. However, I can refer to articles that were written by colleagues where they did test the actual overlay, the widgetry, and I don't remember which company it was, and they did test the widgets to determine whether or not they themselves were accessible, and found that under a number of circumstances that they were in fact not accessible, some of it having to do with magnification and overlapping of content, things that we typically would look at when we do manual audits, and we become more attuned to that these products themselves did not comply with success criteria that we use in our typical testing. So I think there are issues there.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a VPAT for one-wheeled wheelchair.
There's also a couple of hands raised, just so you know.
Yes, there were a couple of hands raised. Madeline, if you'd like to come off mute, and you can even show your video if you like. It's up to you.
Yeah, hi. I'm in agreement with lots and lots of what I've heard here, obviously. So this is not a denial of everything that everyone's experience has told them. But I will say, I don't know how far we're going to get with the hostage taking argument, because what I've seen with a lot of commercial websites is that they change so fast anyway, that a temporary fix might be perfectly fine to the client. I have worked with people who hire us to do a full review of their website, and we give them lots and lots of good advice. And then they come back 2 weeks later or 2 years later, sorry. And I think, oh, they're here for us to check all the work they did over the past 2 years. And it turns out, no, they've implemented an entirely different website in the past year. And now they want us to look at that new one. And we don't know if they ever used the advice we gave them last time. So even customers who I've worked with sort of on a more regular and ongoing basis, who are implementing advice that we give them and they're making changes, if we don't hear from them from 6 months or a year, when we come back, their site has significant changes. So I know that there's a lot to do around the maturity model and getting accessibility into the development stream and all those, and that's a different set of questions. But I'm not sure that telling a company that this will only keep your site accessible as long as you keep paying them is actually going to dissuade them, because they might be planning to do a whole overhaul in 6 months anyway. The argument that I often use that I think is still valid is, by the time you do the work for the overlay to work well, you'll have done most of the work to make the site accessible. Like, if the overlay can change the colors and contrasts and magnification of your site, then surely the site has been designed well enough that user tools can do that too. So that's been one of my major arguments. I love the part where they're hiding from the testing tools, though. That's especially exciting.
Yeah, I like using the hostage because it gets their attention. And you're right, if it's not an entity that is constantly kind of refining, redesigning, you know, but more and more, I love back in the days when, you know, the web was new. We didn't have to worry about accessibility being changed because they weren't being so agile and dynamic around the place. So yeah, I think that there's still some out there. But I like using the word hostage because I think it gets their attention. But your point is very well taken, and I appreciate you also sharing your messaging as well. But the overall point I try to use that for is to really get their attention and really get them to focus that there are choices that they can make that they may not be aware of, that may not only be less expensive, but also provide them an opportunity again to develop an infrastructure that's stronger. The overall goal that we have is to encourage companies to adopt an enculturation of accessibility. So not that there's this entity within them that even speaks to accessibility, but everyone who's part of that process understands that accessibility is part of what they should be doing and focusing on. So I appreciate that feedback.
Would you say then, Anil, just to follow up on what you just said, if a company starts off a dialogue about enculturation, is putting a, you know, say they're starting from a point where they really just don't have any accessibility at all, and there are still companies out there like that, obviously, and they say to you, should we put on one of these overlays while we're getting everything else fixed? Is that a reasonable suggestion? What would you say?
Well, if I was advising them, I'd do much like I've done on this call. I would try to let them know the pitfalls of it, because I would never really advocate for that to be the solution. But as I've acquiesced, you know, or yielded rather in some of these discussions, there is some utility there as long as it's defined. But I always come back to the point that I think a lot of people feel it's more difficult than it really is. The amount of time that it takes to invest in teaching your content developers on how to make things accessible is a much better utilization of your resources, both financial and human. And to Matt's earlier question, they're saying they don't have, you know, a web development staff. Then try to find a third-party contractor to help you develop your website that's not overlay dependent, because
there's better alternatives.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, this is, going down a different direction entirely. But we don't there's no problem with expecting developers to understand security or expecting developers to take security seriously. And platform interoperability. Oh, you didn't tell me that it had to work on Firefox. You're never going to hear that, right? So the the idea that developers get surprised by accessibility is just, look, that's excuse making that I don't think we need to be supportive of.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
But that's unfortunately a completely different discussion. Matt's question, really did hit the nail on the head, which is, I just got told that I can get 100% compliant. What do you mean I have to hire a consultant from Tenon or Deque or Level Access? We all charge the same rates. It's not a surprise, and it's not cheap. So now, but you're going to tell me I can just pay $400 a month to be 100% compliant? Done. And I can't tell you how difficult it is in sales calls when we're talking about our automatic fixing product. When I tell them, no, well, we're only really fixing about 35% of things. Well, then why should I buy that? And I'm like, because we're honest. Like, they're probably fixing less than 35%. They're just giving a bunch of crap. And it's hard to overcome that stuff. And now I'm just ranting.
This may be something we get back to in our statement here, or a question about the statement.
Can I throw one thing in here, Chris?
Do one quick thing, and then I'm going to go to Amina's question.
Okay, so there's a lot, and I mean a lot of people who want for a business a cheap website, and we won't name names, but there's also quite a few companies with little templates. Chop, fill in a few blanks. Now you've got a site. And I've seen them for like doctors' offices and auto repair services, and the range is amazing. So they just said, well, I find that websites are often left to the last thing of the least important thing, but they really want one. Just a weird dichotomy. But the point is, some of those vendors making those cheap templated website products are starting to move in the direction of, okay, fine, we'll make sure that when they do that, they'll be pretty accessible. In the short term, as those things roll out, we're going to see a lot more progress on those small, cheap websites that they won't pay the money for real, customized manual testing and such. And so I am hopeful that those templated low-cost website providers, the sites rolling out is going to change that picture, because you won't need any of these overlays. That's a lot of people are going to get an overlay for something like that because they didn't want to spend the money in the first place.
Yeah. All right. Okay. On to another question that we have from Amina. Amina, if you want to turn on your video, it's okay to do that. Just before we get to your question, Amina, I want to tell everybody, thanks for the questions that have come in. I have a final question that is going to really take up the last 10 minutes. So if you do have additional questions for the panelists, you feel free to put them into Slack for those questions to be answered after the end of this session. So with that, we'll go to the last question from the audience here. This is from Amina Carson. Amina.
Yes, sir. So my question is, are overlays only being used for strictly websites, or are they entering the software as a service cloud delivery construct, enterprise resource planning applications? I will not name a name, but I am concerned that if we continue down this overlay path and we let these companies do that and it enters into that space I just referred to, we're in a lot of trouble, because now we're running into, mark my words, we are on a collision course between accessibility and cyber. I promise you.
Who wants to take that one first?
I will. I'll do it.
Go ahead, Al.
There is one for SharePoint. Now it's not necessary because they fixed SharePoint for the most part. But there's a lot of people that didn't want to upgrade their SharePoint. So I'm naming names because it's out there. So I know some people love the thing, but that would be an example of what you're talking about. So your SharePoint could have been the cloud service, et cetera. And so I haven't seen a significant amount of what I would call overlays, like bundled with a cloud type software as a service. But it certainly could happen. But I think the thing is, for things like that, enterprise folks aren't going for the $12.99 tool usually for an enterprise service. So I think it's going to be less likely because, you know, you don't go get the $9.99 tool for 700 people to use usually. And I'll throw one other name out. I don't see anybody throwing overlays on top of Google products either. So I think right now I don't see that happening, and I tend to think it won't happen in the near term.
And,
Google,
and I would add, part of that is because they're really understanding inclusion of accessibility and enculturation of accessibility. So Microsoft, the OneDrive solution is working for me quite well. So SharePoint is a non-issue for my utility of it. We have very good relationship with Microsoft and Google, and they are not only taking it seriously about enculturating, doing a lot more hiring of people with disabilities, doing a lot more integral testing across departments, but they're also making sure that the tools that they use, that they provide for people to use, also have accessibility built in. You can go into any number of the Microsoft products and see that they have tools to help people create accessible everything, documents to emails, et cetera. And I think that's going to help spread throughout other entities too. So as Al was talking about the little small templates, we've been working to let people know you can use WordPress to create an accessible web presence. So hopefully as we start pointing those particular things out, we will get to the point where people recognize that, again, accessible coding is just good coding.
Yeah, my question, I'm thinking of a specific company and I'm thinking of a specific context. So.
Yeah, it sounds like you got work to do there.
So.
All right. Well, thanks for Amina. That was a great question. All right. Thanks very much. And now I'm going to move on to the final question for the day. Let me just do this. There we go. So the final question that I have for the panel, and I'm going to preface this question because the question in the question I say the professional accessibility testing community. Sure, that means people who attend ICT. ICT itself is not necessarily an organization per se. It's a conference that happens. We have a committee and that sort of thing. We post materials and resources to help people. The W3C is an accessibility testing community, sort of, at least the way portion of it is. IAAP is another community. GSA is another community, government community in effect. So I mean sort of the community as a whole. And this is, so this is, with that preface, here's my question. Could or should there be a collective statement on overlays and or some sort of guidance from members of the professional accessibility testing community that goes out to website developers, the public, and others who are concerned about this on overlays, statement or resource site? One of the things that I thought of in this and took a note from an earlier comment was that this could be an opportunity to educate, to say, actually making your website accessible to begin with isn't that hard. But on the overlays themselves, and so for the panel, do we think that coming together and doing something like this is a goal that we should aspire to? David first.
Yeah, so excellent question, Chris, and I think timely in where we are right now with technology and accessibility. I think the things that we can do would be number one, to acknowledge that there is a gap today in terms of solutions for the marketplace. And that's to the point that Cyndi shared that, hey, are we doing this right? If people are gravitating to this, what we know to be a bad solution, that means something's missing, or we're approaching this and we can do better. And I think we have to begin as a community to acknowledge that there's a gap today. And I'm not saying that we know what that gap is 100% right now, but there's a gap here. The next thing I would do is highlight, I think we should, as a community, highlight the flaws and dangers in the current solution sets that we see out in the marketplace. It's very natural for these types of capitalistic societies. We are going to rush with solutions to try and fill a gap, and our first entry into that gap isn't necessarily the best one. It's going to be the shortest path to bucks. I hate to say that, but that's what's happening, and it's natural in our society. But what we have to do in the same breath is recognize that innovation around healing technology, right? Hey, if we didn't have healing technology, the first modems wouldn't work. Imagine if, modems didn't fix themselves while they were transmitting bits of data over the telephone line, right? If they didn't have that ability to kind of detect, hey, we went off the rails, let's fix this, we would have never gotten an internet, right? So self-healing technologies are really important, and we can't discourage innovation around that. And I think in the decades to come that's where this is headed. And then, but finally, we have to say, hey, look, that innovation, where does it belong architecturally in the scheme of things? And I think, to Anil's point, this type of innovation belongs back at the authoring stage of accessibility, where if we can create healing technologies, get them into the IDEs, get them into the developer environments and the content environments, so that they can see, hey, what you're doing is bad. Here are some ways you can do that better or fix it. So I think that somehow, whatever we do, if we can keep that broad framework in mind, I think it would be very, very helpful.
Other panelists, what do you think on David's comment there? Let's go with Cyndi.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
I can't help but think how important it is for us to challenge what is being purported and done. At the same time, how petty we sound as a field to whine and complain that someone is doing something that we haven't been able to really impact at a broad level in the ways that these tools have, or are starting to, I should say. I don't know. I say to myself, so should we make a grand statement? We definitely need awareness. We definitely need awareness as to what is going on. But it's not going to be a clean message, because not every overlay is bad.
I take what you're saying about petty, about making some sort of resolution statements, but let me bring Anil in. The National Federation of the Blind makes proclamations and statements on behalf of
resolutions.
Yes.
And I don't think that we would ever resolve to condemn and deplore overlays. I want to make sure that my messaging on behalf of the organization is correct. The word I've been using that I think is key is utility. That necessity is the mother of innovation and invention, and laziness is the father. And I think that overlays lean a little bit more on the lazy, but do they have a utility? Yeah, I think I've kind of talked about that. I'm not going to oversell the utility, because my overall goal is to make sure that the entity that's creating the web presence, or whatever the technology is, enculturates accessibility. I just think that's the win-win. And I'm an optimist that I believe that over time it's going to continue to gradually evolve to a space where overlays are very little needed. So if there's a company out there that doesn't have the wherewithal, the resources, and they have this presence, especially if it's something that blind people need to get access to, I'm not going to say don't use an overlay. What I'm going to continue to say is don't be dependent on that as a solution, because we're optimistic and hopeful that those entities that are creating services and access to information that we need will be there for a long, long time. And we recognize that the true benefit is if they have the wherewithal and their own internal infrastructure to sustain that over time. Having to depend on that third party entity to sustain that, that's an X factor that we're just uncomfortable with. And I do applaud a lot of the third party AT consultants in that strategy. Many of them, I think Karl was discussing earlier, the different ones that have kind of overlay components that are using it in a way that I feel is appropriate, meeting an immediate need for providing access, using that to evaluate where those accessibility failures are, hopefully using that to educate their customer and their dev team about how to correct it so they're not continually, perpetually coding stuff in the same way that creates the need for the overlay is important. So regarding your question, I think that a statement, as Cyndi was saying, that really promotes more awareness so that the customer or the organization is not subject to the marketing of the necessity of an overlay would be a good statement. I haven't read the articles, but I intend on reading the articles that you referenced. And I think that as long as that messaging is there and allows the customer to make an informed decision as to whether they feel that the overlays are of value to them and the way they operate, then that's their conscious decision. And I'll just be very candid. If that conscious decision results in an experience that's not accessible, we will first try to work and partner with them if it's something that we feel our blind and low vision members need access to. But again, we are strategic with our litigation. So going into that, being aware of what the potential circumstances are, but again, I don't want to leave that with a threat. Really going into it, knowing what the real benefits are for enculturating accessibility and acquiring that skill set as an internal resource is what I really like to try to see them promote.
You know, Chris, I did want to just ask, you know, are you thinking that this statement would be a broad statement to out kind of to the public, or are you thinking that this statement would be to the accessibility testing community?
I would think of it as maybe something to the accessibility testing community, but then is also
I'm sorry, I misinterpreted
somewhere,
the question.
Somewhere public and available to the to anybody who wants to write about it, and collectively for people in the accessibility testing field to say, you know, to their customers, look, this is the statement from our field about this type of thing. So in terms of we're right about out of time. We're just about to lose the captioner. So in terms of this final thing, should we, shouldn't we? A quick vote of should we, and then we'll figure out the logistics later. Anil, I would say, what would you say? Yes? No.
I'd say yes, but I also interpret it as a broader statement. So yeah, yes.
David?
Yes.
Yes. Alan?
Yes.
Yes. Karl?
I'm going to echo exactly what Anil has said. So
yeah.
far.
And Cyndi?
Same with me. What Anil said.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. That's a great note to conclude on. We'll figure out the rest later.
All right.
Okay. Thank you very much for attending this session.
Thanks for setting us up,
to
Chris.
David O'Neill, to Anil Lewis, to Alan Hoffman, to Karl Groves, and to Cyndi Rowland. And thanks to Stacey for hosting. That